Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the CRKT Scribe Blackout Edition. That's right, this guy is the Blackout Scribe, and I'm interested in taking a look at it. So here we go. First off, in the name of full disclosure, this guy was sent to me by CRKT. They reached out to me, said, hey Nick, we got a new version of this guy. You interested? I said, absolutely, but as always, I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. It might be a gem, it might be junk. They did still send it along. Nonetheless, we do have to assume this is the very best quality controlled one of these guys ever, and I'm doing my best not to let that affect the nature or the quality of my review. Next thing, let's do some size comparison real quick. This is not a particularly large knife. To put it very simply, this is pretty freaking tiny. The blade length on this guy is coming in around, well, actually 4.5 centimeters, just around 2.75 inches, slightly over that line. I'm sorry, 1.75 inches. Turns out numbers are hard. Anyway, so this is pretty small. And if we go ahead and we take this guy and we put it up against, for instance, the Spyderco Delica, we're going to see that this is pretty small. If we put it up here against the Ontario Rat number 2, we're going to see that, again, this is pretty small, right? And if we put it up against the Spyderco PM2, we see that this is pretty small, right? This is not a particularly large knife. One thing that's also worth noting is it is a relatively thin knife. This guy can actually, the entire thickness of the knife itself is only slightly larger than the thickness of the PM2 blade, right? This is thinner than the Delica by a pretty substantial margin. This is a very, very thin knife in the pocket, and so it's relevant there. And then one other size comparison here, this is against the CRKT Overlander, which given is a pretty expensive relative to this guy, but still, it's by the same designer, and the designer here is TJ Schwarz. As you see here, Schwarz design. So there is that. Next thing, one thing that's worth noting is that this particular model here is an upgraded version. This is the 2425K version. This is the Blackout model, and it is using D2 steel rather than 5CR steel, which is good. Now it's reviewable. So look out for the Blackout version in D2 steel. That is the only version of this knife that is worth considering. And so that's the one I've got here on the table. Let's go ahead and talk about what I'm liking, what I'm not liking so much about this little guy. Start with, this is a TJ Schwarz design. TJ's a great designer. I'm a big fan of his work, and he's been doing a lot of weird stuff lately. First, the tailbone knife with the chain built into it. Then this guy in this weird form factor. And, you know, I'm a fan of TJ's. Pretty much anything he does, I'm kind of interested in checking out just because he does good stuff. So it's another one of his. If you're a collector of his work, this is going to be interesting. Next thing. The patterning on the handle here is actually nice. This is not carbon fiber by any stretch of any imagination that I can detect. But it is kind of textured to look like it, right? And ultimately, I think it ends up coming across relatively classy, right? They don't do it on all of the surfaces. They're not trying to make it look like this is carbon fiber. It's just injection molded plastic, but at the same time, it ends up giving a little bit of visual intrigue to the knife, but without coming across as like they're faking anything. It's just, that's the pattern they chose. So that's good. The price on this guy is $30. Now, I don't know if this is the actual MAP price that people are legally required to sell this for, or the fake MSRP price designed to make that MAP price look like a discount. I don't know. I haven't seen this at retailers yet to know that, but it is on CRKT's site for $30. I would sure love if that turned out to be the fake price rather than the real one, and it was actually cheaper than that. This would be amazing, closer to $20, but frankly, even at $30, this feels pretty okay, right? This is in D2 steel. It's a tiny little fixed blade. It's a weird little thing, and it's not going to be for everybody. But what it is, I think, in a reasonable steel, is fine at that kind of a price point, right? So I don't mind the price here, and I'm glad they came in at a pretty good budget level, given that this is a very budget feeling sort of knife. So there's that. Next thing, ergonomics on this guy are interesting. This is relatively thin, but it actually, without the extra cap on there, it fits in pretty well in my relatively small hands. I get a good two-finger grip on this guy with the thumb and whatnot. The clip actually serves to add a little bit of extra texturing to it, so I don't feel like this is particularly insecure in my hand as I'm gripping on this guy, as does the texturing on it, generally speaking. And then you can actually put this little clip guy on, clip the little cap guy on the back here, and that gives you a little bit of extra gription, right? That takes it to a four-finger grip. We'll talk a little bit more later about this not being the most secure sort of joint ever, so to speak, but at the same time, it does give you a sensation of having something in your hand, and gives you some security in holding on to it. It is pretty reasonable in the hand, and a lot better, frankly, than I anticipated it. Next thing, this does have a clip on it, which is sort of meant for right-hand carry, in that when you pull this out of the pocket, the edge is facing down. That said, I don't imagine that this is going to be particularly troublesome for lefties who just have to take it out and rotate. But at the same time, it's a fine little clip. And I do like that they've given you a clip here. And this is a fixed blade that is actually surprisingly pocketable, right? Especially if you're putting this in a pocket with nothing else that could pull this cap off. You know, this could work. More importantly, I think this is a clip for keeping it in things, in like an organizer or something like that. I think that's where this clip is really going to shine more than for pocket carry, but it is nice that they've given us a clip here. Next thing, this is super, super thin. Like I said, this guy comes in ridiculously thin. I'll go ahead and I'll try and measure it up here. The thickness of it is coming in right around 5.3 millimeters, maybe closer to, looks like about around the quarter of an inch, plus or minus some, right? That is not particularly thick. And as a result, this slits very well in a pocket, but also in an organizer. It's not a big lumpy sort of object. So I think that's going to be interesting. Very easy to keep someplace, very easy to store someplace. That thinness is very nice. Then finally, on the good side, this is a fine little blade. In this version, it is a D2 steel, which is a steel that I think is pretty much good to go. It's got this little bit of black wash coating on it, which should help a little bit with rust resistance, which is one of the downsides of D2, relative to some of your other more stainless offerings. And it is coming down to a relatively thin edge. And it comes on both sort of ends here. This is, and came reasonably sharpened. This is a nice little blade here. It's got a nice geometry to it. It's got a very nice, very basic drop pointy shape, but at the same time, it works well. And the way it's designed is very good for utility style cutting in a bunch of different ways, right? I don't know that I would reverse grip this, but I guess you could. Either way, it's a fine little blade. And considering that it's a fixed blade and that they're just life support systems for a blade, that works pretty well. So to me, all of that is the good, is that it is a Schwarz design. It's got a nice pattern. Price is $30, maybe. I'm not sure which price they're using here, and only one of them is real. The ergonomics are okay. It's got a good clip for carry. It's got a nice thin construction overall, and a very nice blade. On the bad side, to start with, guys, it is really dumb that I don't know what the price is here. If you're playing map games to fix the price at one number, just use the one number. That is the only real number here. Life will be easier for your fans, for your community, and probably for you too. Let's just not play this game. Next thing, the original version of this guy, when this first launched, the CRKT Scribe, it launched with 5 CR15 MOV. Now, as the blade steel. This is a fixed blade. A fixed blade has exactly one thing that it needs to do, and that is to have a good blade. So it's important that that blade is well done. And I gotta be real with you. In initial testing, the earlier version got dull faster than a high school assembly, right? It wasn't even ultimately worth reviewing. And so only when they moved to D2 did this knife become at least remotely interesting to me. I just didn't see a world in which I could recommend the other one. And, you know, given they made the adjustment, they fixed it, they heard the community, but the fact that it even launched in 5CR is ugly, ugly, ugly. I would suggest a new rule at CRKT Corporate. Every time somebody says 5CR 15 MOV or one of the other ridiculously cheap corner cutty steels, just everybody needs to look at that person like they just hawked a big old loogie up on the table, right? I'm just like full-on looks of disgust and indignation, because that's kind of how the community is seeing it. Let's be real here. These budget steels are just done. The competition has moved on, and there is no way to make a product cheap enough to offset a decision that compromises the one damn job that a knife has. I feel vaguely bad bringing this up when they did fix it in this model, but the fact that any of them hit the market in 5CR is shameful, all the more so that the original ones is still out in circulation. So people are trying to find the ones with the black wash blade. Those appear to be the only ones that have the steel that's kind of worth a damn. But please, CRKT, can we just go straight to a decent steel next time? That was tough. That was really tough. Now, on to the knife itself. One weird little thing about it that's not a big deal, but I've noticed that as I cap and uncap this guy, the Schwarz design part here, I'll zoom in a little bit, this part is actually very slightly raised, and it ends up accumulating plastic in there, so I have to clean this off every so often. Otherwise, it turns basically black with pieces of this plastic micro powder, whatnot. Whatever, not a big deal at all, but it is just something I have noticed. Next thing, this is, of course, a 1.75-inch blade. And that's going to present some limitations, right? You're not cutting up the birthday cake with this guy. It's not so far from like a little X-Acto-style crafting knife, and so I can imagine people finding obscure uses for it. But the thing is, it's probably not going to replace a full-size fixed blade in your life, so to speak. Or frankly, a dedicated 3 to 4 inch EDC knife. This is just a different thing fundamentally. At this size, I gotta be honest, the Scribe should probably be the Scribble, right? This is not a particularly large knife. Next thing, the cap on this guy. So I like the idea very much of having the cap, but it is unfortunately a little tricky to remove one-handed. Now, I get that they want to make sure that this is harder to remove so that it doesn't accidentally remove itself in the pocket here, but there's not really a way to get like a thumbnail. You kind of can sometimes, if you're lucky and your nail is long enough, get in there and kind of pop that off of there. But for the most part, what I found myself having to do is either just take it off two-handed. We'll talk about why I just had to flip that over. Just pop it off two-handed. Or what you can do is something like this, where you kind of decap it that way and then choke back. It's not the quickest thing in the world. I get that there were compromises here required, but it's still, that's a little frustrating. Next thing, they didn't quite get the sharpening choil right. They needed to take this out just a little bit more because we see there's a little smile at the very bottom of the blade. Is this a big deal? No, absolutely not. But it is still something to be clear about there. Next thing, the cap fit. So this guy has a posting cap, right? This cap is able to slot into this little thing on the back there, and it stays on there with some reasonable security. But the thing is, when you start to actually use this guy in the hand, it does provide a little bit of extra security, but it's pretty easy to break that guy free, right? This isn't a particularly firm grip. And in fact, as I was using this, I was kind of hoping that this would be a little bit better, that this would maybe go in there a little bit deeper or something like that, that would make this just a little bit more positive retention, that would make this feel much more like a four-hand grip sort of fixed blade knife, right? I think they just didn't go quite long enough in the back here for this to really get secure up in there. So, or maybe the tolerances are a little wacky. I don't know entirely, but the fact is that it's on there and it's better than nothing. But at the same time, you can't really trust those last 2 fingers worth of grip. Most of your gription is being done up here, and these back ones are mostly alignment. So do keep that in mind. So there is that. And by the way, speaking of the back here, this right here is a lanyard hole, but if you put a lanyard on there, you can no longer cap the knife unless the lanyard is super duper duper thin, right? If the lanyard fits into this gap right here, then maybe it can still work, but it's still likely to, pull that off. It's worth noting that if you do have a lanyard on there, though, especially one of the thick braided lanyards, it's going to serve the same purpose as this bit can on the back there. So, it's not the end of the world, but it is a thing, right? And then finally on the bad side, the cap on this guy is not symmetrical. So this little guy here looks like it is symmetrical, except it's not. This side has these little cutouts on it. This side does not. And as a result, if I put this guy on the proper way, with the clean side on the clean side, so to speak, everything works fine. If I try to flip it around, though, and recap it, it stops around in this area here. It's very clear that this is not designed to go on both ways, and it makes sense, too, because this little area here is milled out for retention from this little tongue area here, but at the same time, you end up with kind of a USB stick sort of thing, where I found myself very often having to insert it both ways, sometimes 3 times, which is funny because I'm bad at this. But anyways, the cap is not symmetrical, and so if you just have this guy sitting on the table, you're going to have to look up, okay, that side goes here, flip it over. Is it the end of the world? No, but it is a little bit annoying, especially given the fact that this seems like it could have been symmetrical otherwise. So, there is that. And so, to me, all of that is the bad, is that the cap isn't symmetrical. You can't use a lanyard while capping the knife, although the lanyard in many ways would... while putting the cap on the back, while posting the cap effectively, although the lanyard would in many ways replace that. The cap fit isn't super secure when posted, so it's not an incredible grab on the back there. Didn't quite get the sharpening choil. It's not quick to remove the cap one-handed. 1.75 inches is just not a lot of blade. And the text gets covered up here, and the original version was 5CR. LOL. And it's super dumb that I don't know what the real price is because they're playing map games. Final conclusion, though, this is a weird knife, but it's an interesting one, right? It's got a nice design. It's got a nice pattern, an inexpensive price point, fine ergonomics, a nice clip, thin build, and a very nice thin blade. It is frustrating that most of them in circulation were done with a cut corner steel. The text was, it gets obscured after a little bit of use there. The one-hand access is a little weird. The sharpening choil wasn't quite right. The cap doesn't fit quite so well and blocks a lot of lanyard use. And the cap doesn't fit symmetrically either way, leading to USB stick style problems. And by the way, it's worth noting that you got to be a little careful recapping this guy because your finger is right here. So if you miss, guess where that blade's going? So anyways, there we go. Got it. So that could be a little tricky. In total, this is an interesting knife, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is God's gift to EDC, right? No, I don't really feel like this is going to end up replacing the knife that's in a lot of people's pocket, right? This revised version, though, does offer something a little bit more interesting. The first one I don't think was worth contemplating, but this brings enough to the table, that is, to offer something for sort of interesting uses. I don't necessarily, like I said, see this as being everybody's perfect EDC. I'm sure some folks will carry it. I'm sure for those folks it'll probably work okay. But where I see this succeeding is in weird places. Where I see this succeeding is something like a toolkit, right? If you are making a little pack that you can kind of keep in your pack that, has a bunch of different tools in it, this is a really nice way to get a compact knife in there that's worth a damn. Just slip it in there. It's not bulky. It's not thick. It's not huge. This could very easily work, right? Or maybe you clip it someplace useful. Clip it to the side of your pack. Clip it something, and in that case, it could work pretty well. Or frankly, I feel like this is a knife that, unlike a lot of the stuff some of the stuff I review in the channel, like, okay, my next review is this guy, this Spyderco Indela. This is a pocket knife. We have a very firm, defined category for exactly what this thing is going to do for you in your life. For this guy, I don't think that's so much the case. I think people are going to look at this review and see a use for it. They're going to be like, oh, this would be perfect in my, I don't know. This would be really great to keep in my briefcase for this particular kind of cutting. This is something that I think is going to appeal to people for weird scenarios rather than for the boring everyday ones. And if it doesn't appeal to you, if you're looking at it and you're like, I don't get it, I don't need it, then guess what? You don't need it. Problem solved, right? So ultimately, my feeling on this guy is that this is an interesting choice. If you don't see a use for it, then I don't think there's a world in which you want one. Move on with your life. But if you do, if you're looking at this and going, oh yeah, that'd be perfect for, then you'll probably want to write this little Scribe down on your buy-in list. So there you go. Hope this has been interesting to you. Have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.